Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. President Trump signs an executive order aimed directly at curbing the power of social media. This after Twitter added fact-checking labels to a couple of the president's tweets about mail-in ballots. We'll have more on that in a moment. Meantime, markets falling amidst rising tension between the United States and China. The president saying he plans to hold a press conference on China tomorrow. This after Beijing proposed a new, widely controversial national security law for Hong Kong, that's been protested by folks in Hong Kong. Investors concerned these actions could destabilize the global economy. I want to bring in our markets reporter, Taylor Riggs, who's been following all of this, including the broader sell-off, but tech staying stronger. Taylor, break down what happened for us today.
Yeah, it looked like we were green and sort of in the clear into the last hour of trading. And then you sort of mentioned all of the headlines that made markets very nervous. In part, one of the headlines that Trump said that he would have a press conference on Friday to talk about China. And then there's a lot of concerns, of course, about that national security law that China signed that, in effect, would remove a lot of the autonomy from Hong Kong. So really, in the last hour of trading, everything fell apart, but still the key theme remains that some of the big companies are still some of the big outperformers. You see that as the S&P, which is a market cap weighted index, outperformed the equal weight index. Then you have the NASDAQ 100, while in the red, still the better performer relative to the NASDAQ, which also includes some of the smaller companies there. And then, of course, the Russell 2000, which is all the small cap companies, really the big underperformer. So you are still seeing those key themes where everyone, even though we were in the red, flocked to some of the big tech, big name companies to help provide some stability and defensiveness here in what seemed to be some pretty ugly headlines in that last hour of trading.
Well, of course, we'll be following that press conference tomorrow, Taylor. You've also been taking a look at companies issuing debt, some $1 trillion in debt issued so far this year, led by companies like Oracle and T-Mobile. What trends are you seeing here?
Emily, this story totally caught my eye because you think in the middle of a pandemic with all the market turmoil we have been seeing, how are some of these big tech companies managing to tap the debt markets? So far, it only took 149 days for companies to issue $1 trillion in investment grade debt. That is double the pace of last year. Really comes after the Fed, as you know, came out and said that they were going to prop up all the companies that have been ravaged by the pandemic. They promised to provide about $750 billion in corporate bond support via some of these ETFs. And so with the Fed really the buyer and the lender of last resort, all of these companies really rushed to take advantage of these record low rates. Oracle is the second largest borrower so far this year. They issued $20 billion, a lot in part to boost cash. And then you mentioned T-Mobile because they issued the third largest, $19 billion to help fund their takeover of Sprint. So you have spreads now, as you can see on the investment grade ETF and high yield really rallying today. Unbelievable the pace at which these investment grade markets have come so far.
Meantime, quickly, Taylor, Twitter shares ending sharply lower, far lower than the rest of the markets. This amidst President Trump's threats on social media. And of course, we know the president signed that executive order late in the day directed at Twitter and Facebook and Google and other social media companies. Walk us through what happened there.
Yeah, so Twitter and Facebook really going to be the two hardest hit companies. We do know that the president did sign an executive order that would make it easier for regulators to hold the social media companies liable for curbing user speech. It also narrowed the liability protections that these companies have for third-party posts. All of this started after the president and then Twitter put up the fact-checking link on a pair of his tweets. So really Twitter and Facebook, the most hard hit here. And as you can see, these are sort of the details that we're getting from the executive order. It would claim selective censoring, make platforms liable for posted messages, and roll back a lot of the protections that these companies have had since 1996, Emily.
Taylor, thanks so much. The tweets have been flying, as you say, between the president, between Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey. This after the president, again, signed an executive order that would hold tech companies more responsible for content that their users post, as well as how they moderate it, and face these companies with potentially a flurry of lawsuits. Earlier today, the president fired back at Twitter after Twitter added these fact-checking labels to a couple of the president's tweets, singling out a single Twitter employee. In response, CEO Jack Dorsey responded by saying Fact check, there is someone ultimately accountable for our actions as a company, and that is me. Please leave our employees out of this. We will continue to point out incorrect or disputed information about elections globally. That does not make us an arbiter of truth. Our intention is to connect the dots of conflicting statements and show the information in dispute so people can judge for themselves. Earlier, I spoke to Renee DiResta with the Stanford Internet Observatory. She's also a longtime social media commentator. Take a listen to what she had to say.
Really seems quite slapped together. It's very reactive. It's really interesting to see this come about where the trigger, the precipitating factor was a fact check. This is not about censorship. Nothing was taken down. Nobody was put in timeout. No tweets were deleted. This is in response to a fact check. And it's just kind of dredging up something that had come up previously 6 months ago. And it's kind of an ongoing cycle in which it just pops up every now and then whenever the president feels that tech has done something bad to him.
Now, there's a divergence in how social media companies are handling the president's speech, political speech. Of course, you've got Twitter fact-checking a couple of tweets by the president. You've got Mark Zuckerberg out there saying that companies shouldn't be the arbiters of truth. Facebook doesn't fact-check political speech. Who's right in terms of how they're handling this?
Well, I mean, I think there's different spectrums for different platforms and how the dynamics work. But ultimately, what Zuckerberg is saying is that they're not going to fact-check political speech directly, as in on the candidates' posts themselves or the candidates' ads, but Facebook absolutely fact checks and has been doing so for years. And it does so in recognition of the fact that misinformation can be very harmful, particularly in very narrowly tailored areas like stuff related to the pandemic or stuff related to voter suppression. So Twitter has taken the approach of saying they have that same kind of narrow tailoring, but they are in fact appending it directly to the president's tweets. And that's where the real difference is. It feels a little bit like splitting hairs, I think, for most people. But again, you know, Facebook is also fact checking.
Right. So is that statement by Mark Zuckerberg misleading?
I couldn't tell. I wondered if maybe it was like a weird cut of a longer interview and something else was going to come out. I actually really couldn't gauge it because they absolutely do fact check. They have a team of fact checking partners, in fact, recognizing that harmful misinformation and misleading commentary going viral on the platform in 2016 was impactful.
Now, what about Twitter? Obviously, they've now fact-checked a couple of the president's tweets, but I mean, to be fair, of everything that the president has tweeted, fact-checking just a couple, should Twitter be doing more?
I think that they legitimately don't want to wade into fact-checking every single thing that every single politician says, and I think that's reasonable. I think the ones that you want to fact-check are ones where the statement has some kind of weight. So something related to misinformation around voting or misinformation related to health. Those are the two areas that they've identified as bright lines, and that's because there's some sort of harm that comes from misinformation in that regard. If people have bad information about where to go vote, whether they can have absentee ballots, you know, any range of things related to voting, or false cures, quack cures, that kind of thing with regard to COVID-19, that can have really bad impacts directly on people's lives, and that's what they're trying to deal with.
What about false accusations of, you know, potentially being connected to a death that there's no evidence that you're connected to?
That cycle's 24 whole hours old now, right? And I think that didn't get fact-checked, as I recall, because that didn't fall into the realm of either information around health or information about voting. So we have, again, these very narrowly tailored areas. The 12 hours before the offending voting tweets were fact-checked and triggered this entire, storm. Again, as you mentioned, blatant misinformation was left up unchecked. And that angered a lot of people on the other side. So really, I think you have a real debate among the public where there's just very divergent views of how much platforms should be doing and how far they should go.
Now, all of this is ramping up before a critical election. Do you think the platforms are vulnerable of being politically weaponized to the extent that it would undermine the election despite the moves that they're making?
I think that there's a very real risk in misinformation going viral on election day and election night. Yes, I think that this is one of the reasons why the platforms are prioritizing developing infrastructure to label tweets and things like this in May so that they're not caught flat-footed in November. We spent a lot of time over 3 years now talking about what happens with foreign disinformation. But the problem with the social media ecosystem is that information moves very fast. Things go viral very quickly. It doesn't matter who creates them, really. And so you just have the kind of bright line takedowns around things like Russia just don't really apply when it's the president himself or domestic activists or influencers doing the commentary.
So what can and should these companies do? It's not just Facebook and Twitter, but also potentially Google and YouTube would be impacted. What can and should companies do about this executive order?
Really, with the executive order, I think a lot of it is going to be challenged in court. I mean, my understanding from following the lawyers that I pay attention to is that there are a lot of things that are just not going to stick. So I think that the executive order is less of a concern, and they should just continue thinking about what their policies should be in service to making sure that the American people are informed, particularly as we have a critical election coming up.
Now, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're seeing these companies still fight misinformation about COVID-19 specifically, how well do you think they're actually doing?
I think that they've had a lot of real challenges with this, in part because, again, this is the other interesting piece. There is a desire to elevate authoritative voices. And what we've seen with this particular pandemic is that sometimes authoritative voices don't know what's going on. We've seen health authorities be slow to react. We've seen government authorities state misleading information, not only in the US, excuse me, but overseas as well. So the platforms really have a unique challenge of trying to figure out what kind of expertise to surface. And that is I think that is the real debate that is underlying both of these issues. How should the platforms curate? What should they surface? And unfortunately, that debate, particularly in the US, is highly, highly politicized at this point.
Renee DiResta there of the Stanford Internet Observatory. Coming up, China has made up its mind about a new national security law for Hong Kong, defying President Trump. We'll talk about what it all means coming up with a China-Hong Kong relations expert. This is Bloomberg. Despite roaring protests in Hong Kong and threats of sanctions from President Trump, the Chinese government has signed a new security law for Hong Kong that critics say curb essential freedoms in the country. To discuss, I want to bring in Professor Shelley Rigger of political science at Davidson College, who's written extensively about China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Professor Rigger, thank you so much for joining us. This is certainly not the end of the story, but it is hard to see how these Hong Kong protesters can overcome the Chinese central government, or can they?
I think it's hard to see, indeed. They're still trying to show how difficult it will be for Beijing to impose its will fully on Hong Kong, but everyone knows the Beijing authorities are, one, really powerful, and two, really determined.
Now, Taiwan is also getting into the fight. You've got the president of Taiwan tweeting today, all political parties in Taiwan strongly condemn China's decision to bypass Hong Kong's legal process and push for the passage of today's national security law resolution. Beijing responding by saying Taiwan is stirring up trouble, looting a burning house. What role could Taiwan play here?
Well, it's this is a very tricky and sensitive issue for Taiwan because on the one hand, in some sense, Hong Kong is a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for Taiwan. Hong Kong's status is, of course, very, very different. Since 1997, it has been legally part of the People's Republic of China, but under a special formula, one country, two systems, whereas Taiwan has been governed separately from mainland China since 1949. And before that, it was only governed together with mainland China for a few years in the mid-40s. Before that, it was a Japanese colony. So Taiwan's in a very different status. Nonetheless, what we know is that the one country, two systems formula that was used to unify or to bring Hong Kong into a political relationship with the People's Republic of China was actually originally designed for Taiwan. And the idea was that Hong Kong would be this sort of demonstration case and everybody would see how well it worked and then it would be applied to Taiwan. So the fact that it hasn't worked and the fact that it appears now to be effectively abandoned means that the long-standing concept for Taiwan's future, at least the concept held by the authorities in Beijing, is on really shaky ground.
Meantime, you have the U.S. House passing this bill approving sanctions against Chinese officials for how they treat Muslim minorities, the Uyghur population in China. You have the president planning to hold a news conference on China tomorrow. What are you expecting, and what could the U.S. do here in the midst of an already tense relationship between the two countries, but what has been, up to this point, a sort of trade détente?
Right. I think the options available to the U.S. are pretty limited and pretty weak, because what we are facing is a matter that the Beijing leadership has pretty well committed to a course of action and is unlikely to be turned back or deterred. The Hong Kong issue is one of really central importance to the PRC, and I think they thought that as long as things were moving or could appear to be moving in a favorable direction, or at a minimum we're not moving too quickly in an unfavorable direction, there could be a lot of flexibility, and the government in Hong Kong, the local government there, could be held responsible or made responsible for managing the issue. But when things spiraled out of control and the center stepped in, that really is a very hard action to roll back, no matter what the U.S. does. And meanwhile, the U.S. has been, sort of on both sides of the China issue for the past 3.5 years. So maybe missed, it's hard to say really, but may have missed the opportunity to stand up for Hong Kong earlier, before the PRC had fully committed to this course of action. So, I guess what I'm saying is tomorrow may be too little too late.
All right. Well, we will certainly be following tomorrow. Professor Rigger, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
You're very
Professor
welcome.
Shelley Rigger there of Davidson College. Thank you. All right. Coming up, we're going to be talking about a WeWork competitor, Industrious. We'll have the CEO with us next. This is Bloomberg. Does the co-working space model still have investor interest? We're about to find out, as Industrious, a company that counts WeWork as one of its competitors, is taking a step closer to going public. Joining us now is the CEO of Industrious, Jamie Hodari, also the co-founder of the company. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us. So part of your model is making a push toward more suburban offices, as more of us are working from home and looking for options close to home. Yet, given the fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic and both of us are still sheltering in place, is there really demand for this?
Well, thanks for having me. I actually gave myself a self-haircut this morning, which was a very sort of quarantine moment, and I'm very happy I'm on the phone, not on video. But look, I think the reality of working today and moving forward is that the companies that navigate this best, I think, are going to be the ones that give their employees choice, that say, if you want to work from home, work from home. If you want to come into HQ on Mondays, come into HQ on Mondays. And if you want a local no-commute office in Short Hills, New Jersey, or Westchester, or, the northern Chicago suburbs, that's your option too. This sort of putting the power and the choice in employees' hands, I think, is the most important prerogative for most companies as they solve their workplace needs over the next coming years. And the reality is, for most companies, they need a space as a service provider to partner with them in doing that. So I think, the next few years have a lot of sort of demand in store given that reality.
So first of all, Jamie, I just want to let you know that those bad haircuts do grow out, as I learned giving my husband one that was terrible.
Thank God.
Luckily, we're past that. Let's talk about this, though, because, increasingly CEOs are telling us that their employees may be able to work from home forever. I mean, this is a permanent shift. We are in the middle of a permanent shift in how work is distributed, and even when we're out of the pandemic, even when there is a vaccine or a cure. Facebook CEO Sheryl Sandberg told me employees can possibly still work from home. So are you fighting an inevitable trend?
No, I couldn't agree more with that. I never can figure out the right phrase for this, but I think the dominant trend in the workplace for the last 10 years or so has been basically something like the democratization of real estate or of workplace, really doing much better. Instead of saying the CEO lives in Greenwich, so let's put the headquarters in Stamford, really listening to what employees need and want. And what COVID has revealed is that there are lots of different types of employees. There are people who commute 2 hours every day and people who can walk 2 minutes to the office. There's people who have to do 5 hours of childcare every day in the middle of the day and people who are years away from that. And as a result, there's very different needs employee by employee. And the answer, and I think this goes right to the heart of this question of work from home, is not to be coercive. It's not to say you have to come in, and it's also not to say you have to spend the next 3 years in your living room, but rather to give employees the choice. And one of those choices, I couldn't believe more strongly, should be working from home, either all the time or some of the time or whenever that employee needs that.
Right. Now, quickly, you're working towards an IPO as early as next spring. We've obviously seen WeWork's IPO plans fall through. Is next spring an accurate timeline? And what is the investor appetite? We've got about 30 seconds.
So I would say, going public has kind of always been our long-term plan to date. We're reviewing the business in a pretty comprehensive way. And I think kind of middle of next year, we will have some strategic options, and I think we probably haven't gotten to the end of saying what does all of this mean for the timeline, but it certainly seems credible to me, and I do think this is the kind of company, because we do liability light, asset light, partnerships with landlords instead of signing leases, it does feel to me like a company that's a good fit for the public markets.
All right, Industrious CEO Jamie Hodari, we'll keep our eye on you. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have you back when we can see you and your haircut. All right, coming up, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a unique marketplace for advertisers, testing the limits of what they can do. We'll speak with the president of the Interactive Advertising Bureau next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. The COVID-19 pandemic has not spared traditional and digital advertising, and the Interactive Advertising Bureau predicts that phenomenon will continue through the end of the year. Joining me now, David Cohen, president of the IAB, which counts companies like Facebook, Google, and Airbnb among its members. David, thank you so much for joining us. Who's getting hit the hardest in terms of lost advertising right now?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thanks for having me. It's an interesting question. We've been in the market several times, 4 times over the past 2 months to try to identify who is being disproportionately affected. And it's affecting different vertical categories differently, different geographies differently, and different sectors of or types of advertising differently. Traditional is being affected more than digital. So in the immediate term, off from plan somewhere in the 35 to 45% range, digital in the 25 to 35. And if you were to double click on that, publishers are being more affected than programmatic specialists, and search, social, and audio, as well as connected devices like OTT, is actually faring quite well.
So talk to us then about who and what companies and what sectors appear to be the most resilient. I mean, I know that there are some unexpected winners here.
Yeah, I mean, the name of the game, the word that we keep on hearing is agility, the ability to optimize quickly, put something in market, see what works, and be able to get out or adjust accordingly. Those are the folks that seem to be winning. So that's search, that's social, that's podcasts and audio. The OTT and connected television area is also, we've seen obviously explosion of choice from a consumer standpoint, launches of Peacock and HBO Max, et cetera. And consumers are flocking there because there's opportunities, and it's actually the most resilient of all kind of digital formats. We really believe this is the streaming revolution. Everything has been kind of accelerated as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Let's talk about some of the trends then that you see in what remains of ad budgets. I'm reading that breakfast cereal companies, of all things, are spending a lot more.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. There's a wide range, as you would imagine. We tried to get a sense of which categories are being disproportionately affected, and the obvious ones are travel and tourism, brick and mortar retail, restaurants, and auto. But there are still a lot of categories that are actually relatively unscathed. Pets, baby, telco, gaming, beer and wine. And then there are other kind of specific advertisers that don't have any problem selling their product. The stuff is actually flying off the shelf, so they don't need to advertise. So it's an interesting dynamic. It changes kind of week by week, but we're seeing kind of broad, general characteristics that, you know, travel, tourism, retail, brick and mortar, restaurants, and auto, the worse off, and then some of the CPG and in-home usage actually not doing badly at all.
So when do you see advertising budgets returning to normal, given the economic fallout could last for several years? And what does that new normal look like?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. You know, we tried to gauge kind of the immediate term and then Q3, Q4, as well as 2021. So Q3, Q4, as I said before, is probably in the 35 to 40% off expectations range. We're optimistic. We're cautiously optimistic as sports comes back online. We think that there's going to be a pent-up demand for live sports, unlike anything that we have seen in the marketplace before. So we think, based on what we're seeing from the marketplace or hearing from the marketplace, the back half of the year could be off only like 15 to 20%, or even better. Now, 2021 is another story. You know, we go through this kind of upfront television advertising process typically, and I think that's being rewritten as we speak. Initial indications was that it was going to be off by about 20%. It might be slightly more than that. Our guess is that the television marketplace is going to take a page out of the digital playbook and be a little bit more just in time, as opposed to having to commit a year in advance. Once again, the word of the day is flexibility and agility, and I think we're seeing that play out in the marketplace.
Meantime, we've got a critical election coming up, lots of debate about what's fair and not fair in political advertising, and of course, that's going to be a significant portion of income this year for a number of social media companies, for Google. What trends are you expecting to see when it comes to political advertising and how the Biden and Trump campaigns spend?
Yeah, I mean, digital has been good at lots of things for a long, long time. Targeting based on exhibited characteristics, what we know about a consumer, and obviously a privacy-compliant way, is one of the things that digital is very good at. Getting folks to react, lean in, donate if necessary. Everyone comes to the table with very, very good understanding of who's their base, who are the undecided, how do they use and leverage digital technologies to reach, recruit, and bring folks over to their side of the table. So I fully anticipate digital has always been a disproportionate winner in the kind of political ad spend game, and I'm certain that we're going to see that this year as well.
Now, obviously, I know Facebook and Google are among your members. These are two companies that we cover almost every day here on Bloomberg Technology. It's interesting. On one day, you see Facebook getting love from investors. On another day, it's Google. Do you see that one or the other is better positioned in the middle of a pandemic? I mean, both saw a decline in ads in March. Facebook said that was stabilizing in April. We don't know what the latest numbers look like. But is Google or Facebook in a better position here?
You know, I think as I said before, the folks that are able to take creative, adapt messaging, because that's been one of the greatest challenges for marketers. How do they resonate either in direct response or in brand advertising? How does it make sense in the environment in which they're advertising? I think both Google and Facebook have complementary offerings in that space. Obviously, Google has a phenomenal search offering. Facebook is a fantastic social platform. Both of them give you the agility to at scale with very, very limited friction, little friction, go to the market, put something in, read the results, and optimize accordingly. So I think I don't see one kind of benefiting over the other. I think that both will be beneficiaries.
All right, David Cohen of IAB, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insights there. All right, coming up, we'll have more of Bloomberg Technology after this quick break. New Jersey has been ravaged by the coronavirus, taking the lives of 11,000 people in the state. Earlier today, Bloomberg's David Weston caught up with the governor of the Garden State, Phil Murphy. They talked about the dangers of reopening and how to prevent more loss of life. Take a listen.
I hope what we can offer folks is that, some basic sort of themes, which is number one, public health creates economic health. In as much as we're all chomping at the bit to get everything opened again, if we transpose those steps or we jump the gun, I think we throw gasoline on the fire. And I think we've been very deliberate. And the second handed glove with that is we say all the time that data determines dates. So in as much as we don't ever want this to be abstract, in fact, we eulogize a handful of people every day. I call families every day to make sure it always stays personal. Having said that, this is Moneyball. This is what's the data telling us and what's that data allow us to do. And I hope that we get that right. So far, so good.
And in just about every one of those briefings that I've seen, at least, you also give credit to people in New Jersey for complying with the restrictions that are not easy to comply with. You mentioned chomping at the bit. People are chomping at the bit in New Jersey and elsewhere as well. As you start to back off, and it's not just an on-off switch, it's by measures, how do you ensure compliance? It's going to get harder and harder.
Yeah, it probably is. But I have to say, both individuals, David, in terms of staying at home and staying away from each other and wearing face coverings, as well as businesses, both big and small, the compliance has been overwhelming relative to any expectation. Now, clearly, as the weather's gotten warmer, as the clock has continued to tick, as folks see other states that have been less hard hit than New Jersey and New York, as they, that's all human nature, and I get that. Are there more folks today than there were a month ago saying, I'm going to open on June something? Yeah, there are some more, but I will say this. And by the way, I think the other point I would make is that we've started to open up. This is not, we recognize that we need to take steps. We're going to, over the next few days, announce a whole lot more steps. For the most part, folks have done the right thing.
What about the politics of it within New Jersey? We've seen, at least in some other places, some other states, a fair amount of politics involved, where some people are really not just clamoring to get back, but really demonstrating, pretty active in it. What's been the politics in New Jersey? Do you have the legislature with you? Do you have the politicians backing you here?
Yeah, for the most part, we do. There's been some demonstrations. There's no question about it. Nothing at the scale that we've seen in a place like Michigan, for instance. But there have been pretty regular demonstrations, and I don't begrudge that. We never have. I would prefer folks did them virtually and that they don't congregate, but that bothers me more than the demonstrations. There's always exceptions with any legislature, but we've had a very good across the aisle give and take, generally strong support, and we've needed them. We need laws to get passed. We need to, for instance, we need an ability to borrow money to fill up the enormous budget hole that we have, as an example. But so far, so good. Again, there are some folks who naturally in any democratic reality are going to go off and say and do their own things. But for the most part, we've been in a good place.
One of the tricky things everyone is confronting is reopening of the schools. Now, fortunately, with the summer, most people are not going to school anyway, but you've got the fall coming up. It's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to work. As you approach that question, What are the criteria you're going to use? What are the things you're considering about how and when to open your schools?
Yeah, we've promised folks by sort of mid-June, we're going to give them guidance, at least on pre-K through 12. And we're clearly talking to the universities and higher ed community constantly as well. And it's my bias, David, strongly is that we get back to school. We've done the virtual stuff as well as any American state, but there's for a whole host of reasons, including mental health, the richness of the experience. I want to see us back in school, but it's got to be a new normal.
New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy there with David Weston. Meantime, he threatened to do it, he tweeted about doing it, and in the end, he did do it. The president signing an executive order aimed at curbing the power of social media companies. We've just now, minutes ago, seen the full text of this executive order. Joining us now from D.C. is Bloomberg's Ben Brody, who's been taking a look. Ben, I am looking at the executive order here in front of me. The president saying Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube wield immense, if not unprecedented power to shape the interpretation of public events, to appear or to censor, delete, or disappear information and control what people see or do not see. The president calling this censorship. Tell us more about the details here.
Yeah, so Trump is really targeting the companies by going after the liability protections that they enjoy vis-a-vis users' content. There's two very closely related protections that they enjoy. One is for content that they leave up, user content that they leave up, and the other is for user content that they take down in what's called good faith. And so Trump is basically asking or pushing the Federal Communications Commission to define good faith, to define bad faith. And, once that gets narrowed and defined, the companies could face a lot more liability, particularly for the kinds of things that they're taking down, which is, in a lot of cases, the things that people allege are silencing them.
What can the president actually do here? I mean, we have this executive order. The goal is to encourage a reconsideration of this Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which was, to be fair, came into law in 1996 before Google existed, when Mark Zuckerberg was still a child. But how would this legally actually work?
Well, I think there are huge questions about that. For one thing, the FCC as an independent agency, it doesn't have to take orders from the White House. Section 230 also does not grant any rulemaking authority to the FCC or any other agency. I think it's a big question whether or not they can do that. And then you get into much bigger sort of constitutional questions about free speech. If he's really doing this to kind of come back at Twitter because they fact-checked him and that enraged him, that's unconstitutional, and it's probably going to get thrown out despite the kinds of bureaucratic levers that they're invoking here to get this done.
Meantime, you cover lobbying by these tech companies in Washington, and they've been lobbying and spending more on lobbying than ever. How do you expect the companies to fight back? How have they been fighting back? Because this is certainly not the first time the president has claimed they're censoring him.
Yeah, absolutely. I expect them to be really participating in the FCC process if the FCC does pick this up. There are some pointers to the Federal Trade Commission as well. I expect them to go there. But a lot of the action is going to be in Congress. At the end of the day, they make the laws in this country. Trump seems to forget that a little bit. But I think that the companies are going to be really doubling down there. One of the things that I think is most interesting is a late add to the order, which basically tells the Justice Department to prepare kind of model legislation that Congress might want to adopt to try to affect all of these kinds of things. Now, it might not go through in this political environment, but I think kicking it to Congress is a sign of where the fight is really going to be. And then, of course, you have the courts.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you'll be following the twists and turns for us. Bloomberg's Ben Brody in Washington. Ben, thank you so much for breaking it down. All right, still ahead, we're going to head to Hong Kong, where protesters continue massive demonstrations against China's tightening grip. We're going to have a live report on the situation and what is at stake next. This is Bloomberg. President Trump has announced he will be holding a news conference about China on Friday. This after Beijing passed a sweeping national security law that critics say curbs essential freedoms in Hong Kong. Joining us now live from Hong Kong, Bloomberg's Stephen Engel, who's been following this story. Of course, Stephen, we know that protesters have been filling the streets where you are. Of course, we're still far away from the actual implementation of this law, but Beijing has approved it. Tell us the very latest.
Well, the latest is, of course, China pretty much defying that threat from the White House on some sort of retaliatory action for China passing this security law. So the National People's Congress in Beijing passed that sweeping national security law for Hong Kong late yesterday. Of course, you've covered the NPC before. You know it's sort of derided as a rubber stamp legislature. So when China came out with this announcement that it was going to have the security law for Hong Kong late last week, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion it would be approved. And sure enough, the vote was 2,878 to 1. With one abstention or 6 abstentions, so it was passed through. However, it won't be implemented yet because the NPC Standing Committee, which has to pretty much formally draft the laws and then approve it. So we could be several months away before Hong Kong gets this new sweeping anti-subversion, anti-secession, anti-terrorism, anti-foreign interference law implemented. But again, there's been a chorus of support and derision on this law across different swaths of society here in Hong Kong, obviously.
The U.S. and China had been in a sort of trade détente, but this has all been complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic and now this. What kind of response do you think we could get from President Trump tomorrow?
It is an election year, isn't it? It'll be interesting. Is Trump's priority going to be Facebook and Twitter, or is it going to be China? It's not either or, but it could be an interesting decision what he has to say tomorrow at that press conference Friday in the United States, because, you know, the Trump administration, you know, took the significant step of saying it would no longer certify Hong Kong as being politically autonomous from China. That bombshell coming from Mike Pompeo earlier this week. And that could trigger a host of options for the White House, including revoking the special trading status that the United States has bestowed on Hong Kong since that U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. Basically, essentially, it could make Hong Kong no different on the trade front, on policy and tariffs, than any other Chinese city, and could threaten Hong Kong's role as an international financial hub. But there are other options. He could freeze assets of key Communist Party authorities. He could put up those tariffs on Hong Kong exports. Granted, it's smaller percentage of Chinese exports go through Hong Kong, 12% last year compared to 42% in 1992. But still, it's a much bigger pie. 12% of a much bigger pie is still a pretty sizable amount. Larry Kudlow, he's saying Beijing's move was a huge mistake, and they will be held accountable. So let's wait to see how much political capital Donald Trump wants to put in Hong Kong.
Meantime, when it comes to the protest, does it feel a little like deja vu to you, an echo of the protests we saw last year, or does it feel different this time?
It feels different because we're coming out of 3 months of coronavirus lockdown and an absolutely decimated Hong Kong economy as a result of the protests, the trade war, and the coronavirus. There seems to be, again, this is anecdotal and just kind of getting a pulse check of the city, there seems to be less widespread support. The hardcore is still there. Absolutely. People like Jimmy Lai, the Next Media founder, he was on Bloomberg television yesterday saying we have to immigrate or fight, and fight was probably more of the operative word. So they're emboldened by the White House's move. But again, the broader support, we're seeing a litany of different figureheads, including Li Ka-shing, the richest man here in Hong Kong, coming out in support of this Hong Kong national law for security. He's saying it's China's right to invoke such laws. Other people, the Hong Kong Property Developers Association was out. A number of different prominent people have been coming out saying, we need this. After 11 months of unrest on the street, the coronavirus, the decimated Hong Kong economy, we need stability. But there's always going to be those people on the street saying, we need to preserve our freedoms. But the size of protests are definitely smaller, Emily.
All right, Bloomberg Stephen Engel for us in Hong Kong. Stephen, thanks so much for waking up for us and giving us the view from where you are. Really appreciate it. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We're going to continue to cover all of this. We'll be across the president's news conference, if indeed it does happen, on China tomorrow, Friday in the United States. Stay tuned. Bloomberg Daybreak Australia is next. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.